Jack Tanner was not the kind of man you noticed easily. 15 years ago, he had been a respected name in military aviation circles. Today, he was just another sun-tanned face from the Pacific, working among forgotten islands, piloting an aging single-engine plane that looked like a jumble of parts sewn together with duct tape. He avoided stares, avoided questions, and most of all, avoided any memory of the USS Valiant. The name still echoed in his head like an uncomfortable whisper, a reminder that one clear night, a miscalculation and a moment of hesitation had taken the life of his best friend. Since then, he had flown low, in every sense of the word, and made sure no one remembered him. The weather was strange that morning, the sky too dark for the time of day, and the wind was blowing in a way that made the small plane shake slightly before it even took off. Jack had to take off on a simple flight to take supplies to a village on a nearby island. It was a route he knew by heart. No risks, no surprises, but something in the air felt heavy, as if the weather were trying to warn him that this would not be another ordinary day. On the radio, static, nothing out of the ordinary, until, amid the monotony, a barely audible voice broke through the noise, a faint, distorted call, almost swallowed by the hiss. Mayday, ferry, 4 people, storm, lost. The message cut in and out, but it was enough to freeze Jack's blood for a few seconds. He looked up at the sky ahead, where thick clouds were already beginning to form, and knew he had just heard something he could not ignore. Jack wasn't the kind of man who made decisions on impulse, or at least he wasn't anymore. After what had happened on the deck of the Valiant, every choice he made had been tinged with caution, with fear disguised as caution. But here, floating over an ocean that was about to go mad, with the voice of someone pleading for help escaping through the crackles of the radio, he felt something different, an uneasiness growing in his chest. He knew that the Coast Guard was too far away at the moment, and that any protocol would have recommended recording their position and continuing their flight. But there were 4 people adrift, possibly in a lifeboat, and the storm was coming fast. The idea of turning away, of pretending he hadn't heard, was like betraying everything decent that remained in him. Without saying a word, not even to himself, Jack pulled the stick to the right, made a sharp turn, and changed course. He had no plan. All he knew was that he had to get there. The storm arrived sooner than he expected. Heavy clouds covered the sky within minutes, swallowing up any hint of a horizon. The plane was shaking so badly that the dashboard dials vibrated with a low hum, and visibility had dropped to almost zero. With every minute, the fuel gauge dipped more alarmingly. Jack muttered numbers under his breath, recalculating distance, time, and margin of error. The plane had no sophisticated equipment, no radar, no navigational aids. It was him against nature again, and this time he could not miss. When he saw the small orange speck in the middle of the raging ocean, he almost doubted his own eyes. A life raft being swallowed by waves that seemed bigger than the plane itself. Inside it, movement, bodies. 4. Jack felt his stomach turn. They were still alive, but for how long? The turbulence rocked the plane like a toy in the hands of an agitated child. Jack flew as low as he could without putting the aircraft at risk. He tried to radio again, but heard only more static. No nearby frequency was picking up the distress signal, and the raft seemed increasingly vulnerable, about to capsize. The faces of the 2 children were almost impossible to see, but their arms raised in desperation made it clear that they were still fighting for their lives. Jack knew he couldn't rescue them alone. There was nowhere to land, no way to get closer. The only way to save them would be to call a ship big enough to handle the sea, but time was against him. And when he pulled out the old folded map stored next to the dashboard, his eyes stopped on a name that made his heart beat differently. USS Valiant. It was closer than he would have liked. For 15 years, Jack had avoided everything that had anything to do with that ship. He had changed countries, his professional identity, his route. It was as if part of him had been buried there, on that deck where everything had collapsed. But now, with 4 lives hanging in the balance and every second costing him more, he realized he had no other choice. He picked up the auxiliary transmitter, adjusted the naval emergency frequency, and, with a firm voice but a tight throat, made the call. USS Valiant, this is Jack Tanner. I'm on a single-engine civilian aircraft, looking like a life raft adrift. 4 people on board. I need immediate assistance. For a few seconds there was only silence. Then a brief response. Confirm identity and reason for contact. That dry military sentence hurt more than any judgment. Jack didn't say everything. He only answered with what mattered. I have coordinates. They will die if they are not rescued. The line went dead right away, but he knew they had heard him. The fuel was already reaching the critical zone. Jack did the math for the 4th time, squinting to focus on the shaking dashboard as the plane struggled against the crosswind. He had minutes, maybe less. Either he had to find a way to land quickly, or he would crash into the sea, and then 5 lives would be at risk. He knew the Valiant would never let him land under normal conditions, especially not in a civilian plane, with no hook, no booster, no preparation whatsoever. But this wasn't a normal situation either. He set the transponder to emit a distress signal and headed toward where the Valiant should be. Each mile seemed to take forever, but when he broke through one of the cloud layers, the steel monster appeared. Huge, wet, moving with difficulty in the raging sea. Jack almost felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. This was déjà vu, but this time he couldn't fail. The deck was busy. Helicopters were being readied. Crews were running back and forth. Someone down there must have known who he was, and yet there was no sign of landing clearance. Jack approached from the side, flashing the plane's lights in code as he did in blind approach training. A last attempt at communication, a silent plea for a chance. The Valiant's tower finally responded, approach denied, landing conditions unsafe. Jack didn't argue. There was no time. He began the descent anyway, lining up the plane with the deck as if repeating an old ritual, each movement imbued with memories that burned inside him. The rain was now like needles hitting the windshield, the sea pushing the ship from side to side, but he kept his focus. The approach was suicidal, and he knew it. But inside that plane, there was no room for fear anymore. There was only one mission. The impact was not soft. It never would be. The plane hit the deck like a blow, the landing gear screaming in protest, and for a moment Jack thought the fuselage would split in half. But he held on with steady hands, tense arms, and eyes straight ahead. The plane slid across the wet deck with no hook, no auxiliary brakes, just the resistance of the tires and the counterforce of the engine in full reverse. It missed the mark by inches. It came to a stop near the edge, the sound of the wind and rain muffled only by the pounding of his heart. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the deck crew rushed to the aircraft, opened the side door, and pulled Jack out. He said nothing. He was soaked, shaking, but conscious. All he wanted was to be heard, not as a pilot, but as someone who could not allow another life to be lost through inaction. The officers did not welcome him warmly. Many still remembered him. The accident, the flawed report. A younger captain, who had probably read about the case in some internal document, watched him suspiciously, but Jack did not back down. He pointed to the radio, asked them to check the frequency, and explained the position of the ferry and the situation of the victims. He spoke quickly, clearly, without emotion in his tone, as if each sentence were an urgent report. He did not apologize. He did not justify his presence. He simply insisted that if they did not act within 20 minutes, the ferry would capsize. The captain hesitated. But given the accuracy of the information and the fact that the civilian plane was now occupying part of the deck, there were few options. The helicopters were ready. All they had to do was take off, and that is what they did. Jack stood by the side of the runway, watching the rotors spin and the helicopters take to the skies. He was no longer the pilot here, but he was the reason this was all happening. Time seemed to have stopped as Jack watched the helicopters take off from the deck. The sky was still overcast, the wind cut his face like blades, and the noise of the propellers mixed with the roar of the sea created an almost unreal atmosphere. An older officer approached, recognized him immediately but said nothing. He just watched. Perhaps there was no more room for judgment here. The past was done, and the present demanded urgency. Jack couldn't get the faces of the children he had seen on that raft out of his mind. The look of fear, the arms flailing in the waves. He wasn't a father, he had never been married, but something about that scene had broken through the defenses he had built up over the years. It wasn't about saving his own honor. It was about doing the right thing, even if it was too late. The minutes dragged by. The tower radio kept the crew informed of each helicopter's progress. The conditions were extreme, and even experienced pilots reported difficulty in locating the ferry accurately. The storm made the sea look like a battlefield. But then a voice came over the radio, firm, relieved. Visual confirmed. 4 aboard. They're alive. There was silence for a few seconds on the deck. No one celebrated. It wasn't time yet. Jack exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath since the moment he'd changed course. He knew the hardest part was yet to come, the rescue itself, hoisting each person to safety, facing gusts of wind that could capsize an aircraft. But he also knew that this time he wasn't alone. He had done his part, and perhaps for the first time in many years, he felt like he'd made the right decision. The rescue took more than 20 minutes, but to Jack, it felt like an eternity. He couldn't take his eyes off the horizon, where the helicopters disappeared and reappeared among the dense clouds, as if they were fighting against time itself. When the first one returned, with the children already on board, wrapped in thermal blankets and oxygen, silence fell on the deck. No words were spoken, but the weight of that moment was visible on everyone's faces. Soon the second helicopter landed, carrying the 2 adults, exhausted, soaked, but alive. Jack took a step forward as if to get closer, but stopped. This wasn't his victory. There was no medal, no speech, no headline. It was just a moment of peace, a silent relief. He just watched as the medical team rushed the rescued people into the ship. And inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in many years, relief without guilt. After the helicopters landed, no one came to greet him. There were no handshakes, no looks of admiration. Instead, one of the sailors, a young man in a sodden uniform and calloused hands, walked past him, paused for a second and said softly, "If it weren't for you, they would have died." Jack just nodded. He didn't need more than that. The rain was beginning to ease, and the sky was slowly turning a lighter shade of grey again. The captain, who had greeted him coldly now, approached him with a more thoughtful look. He informed him that they would refuel the plane and that he could leave as soon as the weather cleared. There was no anger, no accusation, just a silent understanding that Jack Tanner had done what most people wouldn't dare to do that day. And that, for a man who had spent years trying to forget who he was saying a lot. Hours later, with the sky clearer and the sea less rough, Jack's plane was repositioned on the deck. He inspected the controls himself, tested the flaps, and checked the now full tank. There was no rush to leave, but there was nothing else to do there either. As he prepared to return to the cockpit, he took one last look at the ship. It was the same deck where his world had collapsed years ago, but now it seemed different, not because the place had changed, but because he had turned back, faced everything, the looks, the guilt, the memory, and decided to act, not to erase the past, but to not let it define another day of his future. The plane's engine roared as it started, and he taxied calmly to the takeoff point, where the signalmen were waiting to give him the go-ahead. Jack took off without looking back. Not because he wanted to run away, but because he knew that this time he was leaving nothing hanging. Up there, with the evening light breaking through the clouds, he thought about his family, who were now safe. He thought about the friend he had lost, about the mistake he had made, and about everything he had carried for 15 years. The pain had not gone away. The scars had not disappeared, but something inside him had changed. For the first time, he did not feel like a fugitive. He felt like he had done what needed to be done, even when no one expected it, even when everyone still saw him as that pilot who had failed. For Jack Tanner, there had been no audience, no redemption in headlines, but there had been something greater, a moment of choice, of courage, and of truth. And that, for someone who had spent half his life trying to silence his own ghosts, was enough. Enough to start over.